All righty then. So, yes, of all those other programs you mentioned, something that was easier to watch than the wrestling programs was the biography this week. Another good guy. Mick Foley comes off likable. Edge comes off likable. Rey Mysterio came off likable. Another good guy being profiled by biography. Again, it still stands out that the Randy Savage biography was the only one that seemed like they had an axe to grind. But I like this because, I mean, obviously I knew Rey Mysterio comes from a wrestling family in terms of his uncle, the original Rey Mysterio. But I'd never seen a lot of that footage, never seen the family pictures, didn't have a firm idea of Rey's childhood and growing up and what he went through training. So it was nice to see all that footage and interviews with his parents. Have they ever been seen before in public?
I've never seen them before. I don't know if they were included in any previous biographies that WWE's done on DVD or anything, but it was very nice to see them.
So, and they established from the start of the program, and this will come in later on, the importance of the mask in not only in lucha in general, but also to Rey and the honor of his uncle passing it on to him. And that's one thing I didn't know that you would have just thought, or I always just envisioned it, that the nephew of Rey Mysterio Sr. would be his father's brother, but it's his mother's brother. Or the Smothers Brothers, or
the Smothers Brothers' mother.
Yeah, who was the mother of the Smothers Brothers? All right, St. fucking Abbott and Costello. They had great vintage footage of Tijuana. That was cool with all those fucking cars of the era and etc. And this kid, from the time that, he was small, he was going to school, working a job at Godfather's Pizza. And boy, that brought back great memories. When's the last time you went to a Godfather's Pizza?
I've never, ever had a Godfather's Pizza.
You have
That's a bullshit chain. That's a bullshit chain.
No, they were great in the 70s and 80s. Godfather, holy shit. And then he'd go to wrestling school at night. And finally, they told the story of Rey Sr. agreeing to train Conan as well. And so Conan and Rey begin the lifelong friendship. And he turns pro. He's only 14. And God, you can tell the size of him at 14. He looked like he was, because, look at him now, obviously. But without the physique or anything, he looked like he was 10 years old. And, it even in lucha, where the guys a lot of times were smaller and did more flying, they made the point that everybody scoffed at this and it was completely ridiculous. And with any other human being in the world, it probably would have been. But I think that's what we've got to say this at the top. The same principle that applies to poor Mick Foley, one of the biggest stars in the history of the business, one of the most deserving people, one of the greatest talents, but he has to bear the burden, as I mentioned when we talked about the show a couple weeks ago. He has to bear the burden of bringing in a bunch of guys wanting to be wrestlers in the business that all they saw was the bumps and they wanted to be deathmatch fucks, and people who were too stupid to grasp Mick's talent and intelligence and psychology and charisma and likability and promo and the whole 9 yards, and just saw thumbtacks. Rey has to bear the brunt of the blame for every guy who's 5'2" and 135 pounds or whatever, thinking that they can and should be wrestlers, and they'll say Rey Mysterio, overlooking the fact of his, not only his one in a million or 1 in a billion likability and charisma, physical charisma, but also the talent that he had physically to do the flying and still not make it look like this soft, choreographed ring around the rosy bastardized Western swing dancing that they're doing now, where they just join hands and prance about, do a backflip, and then do a bow to the audience like the goddamn acrobats at Cirque du Soleil. Rey Mysterio and Eddie Guerrero, or Rey Mysterio and Dean Malenko, or whatever, they still didn't lose the contest. They were competing against each other and foiling each other with these incredible moves instead of cooperating, obviously and visually, to the point where it's just nausea-inducing. And it's the same thing, that all the people had tried to copy Tiger Mask Sayama and Dynamite Kid. And you get a bunch of skinny beanpole jerks with no physiques and no goddamn star quality doing choreographed wrestling moves in homage to these guys instead of the way that they did them to begin with, which drew you in and made it believable. They even showed footage here of Mysterio with Kevin Nash. And that time, remember in WCW when Nash put Rey Mysterio over to take some of the heat off of him because they wouldn't put anybody over. So he put the smallest guy in the company over. But it worked because it was Rey Mysterio. And also because Nash wanted it to work there.
To your point, we see a lot of that copycat stuff nowadays, like even something that we didn't like the Will Ospreay Ricochet opening where they just did like a 2-minute running, diving sequence. Like that kind of shit gets copied now in the indies. I hate seeing it, but, with Rey Mysterio specifically, or Rey Mysterio Jr., if you remember when AEW first popped up and you first noticed Marco Stunt and were making comments about how ridiculous he was, that was the defense people had. Rey Mysterio was the same size. Rey Mysterio, ignoring what you just said, Rey Mysterio was 1 in a million. Rey Mysterio isn't just another 5'2" wrestler. He was very special from the beginning.
But even they were ignoring eyesight also, because did you see Rey in almost every clip in this program from the time that he really even started in AAA before he went to WCW? He turned pro when he was 14. He looked like shit physically. But by the time he was in AAA and about to go to WCW, he had a physique. Dwarf dong sucker, always looked like a pale dish rag being hung from a line. He had no definition, no weight, no muscle tone, no evidence that he had ever been an athlete or worked out at anything. And that's a difference that people willingly overlook. Oh, I'm the same size as so-and-so. Well, my cousin Larry is the same size as Conor McGregor. 2 completely different visuals.
It's the first time we've heard confirmation of the size of Cousin Larry here on the show.
Well, he may have fleshed out a little bit over the past few years, but anyway, so back to Rey and the biography. And finally, going back a little bit before, he got to AAA and WCW, Rey Sr. finally made him Rey Mysterio Jr. He bestowed that on him when he was ready, because before he'd been like the green lizard and the hummingbird. And that probably wasn't going to go anywhere. And then Conan gets Rey in on the ground floor of AAA, which didn't go well at first. They had no money, but then finally it took off, and they do the When Worlds Collide pay-per-view in 1994, and people see on a more widespread basis for the first time Rey Mysterio, and, they're, what the fuck? He gets a lot of buzz.
Conan was great here. I've killed him for different things, but he actually was fantastic in this documentary.
Yeah, and, he's been an advocate for the Mexican talent for years and years, and he was in on the formation with Pena of AAA, and he's always tried to agent, the lucha guys into the American companies and be that conduit. And, you could at least, he saw something in Rey Mysterio and he stuck by him. He stuck by him. He stuck by him. He did. Now I sound like Conor McGregor. He stuck by him. Who the fuck are you? But, he stuck by him and he got him in places. Of course, then Paul E. pops in. And, of course, he sees him on the When Worlds Collide pay-per-view and wants to bring him to ECW because that was, at the time, that was the perfect audience, the smart audience. Would you say at that time, this is probably getting into more of your wheelhouse, the ECW crowd comprised, 80-90% of the smart fans in the country. That was pretty much what they, and to a lesser extent, WCW.
Overall, I couldn't put a number on it. In Philadelphia alone, I wouldn't say that, but you got to remember, too, the pay-per-view was November 94. Paul Lee did a lot of stuff with John Arezzi in 93, overseas and stuff, even in the States, and John Arezzi was the one who hooked up Conan with Ron Skoler, which brought AAA to the big arena in California.
Right.
So Paul Lee had been around Conan, the Minis. He was pretty well aware of all these things. And also, AAA was airing in the New York area. It didn't air on Long Island, but if you were in Manhattan, if you were in Brooklyn, Queens, you got AAA. That's how I was able to. Eric Bembed in 93 sent me Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Heavy Metal. I couldn't believe it. It was incredible. 2 out of 3 falls. So Paul Lee, if he said that he only was aware of it because of When Worlds Collide, I'd be shocked because he was pretty well aware.
Well, no, I know. He knew everybody that was doing anything at that point. But here's the thing, when Ray gets buzz from the pay-per-view, yeah, I'll bring him up here. But that's what I'm saying, is that was the perfect place at the time for Rey Mysterio, because the smart fans were buzzing about him and were into him. And ECW comprised most of the smart fans.
And the problem became, beyond future problems with ECW, Paulie would bring in guys from, let's say, Mexico, because he brought in Conan, he brought in Ray, brought in Psychosis, then Ray and Juventud had some great stuff in ECW. So around the time, Chris Jericho comes in, Dean Malenko and Benoit had just been there. Paulie's bringing in great guys from out of town, and they're almost one by one getting picked off by WCW, and he's being left with eventually he'll be left with just his own guys, because all these fly-ins get picked off by WCW.
Right. But and I love Paul on these shows because he's a great talking head, but this kind of proves the point that I was making to people who care to pick up on that point. He sits down and says, well, they came to me and said, can we use a chair? Can we use a table? I said, this is your canvas paint. He let them do anything they wanted to, just like Tony Khan is doing now. He let the guys do whatever the fuck they wanted to do with these stunts and this bullshit, because it was a car wreck and his people were going to pop for it. But that started this fucking trend in America. And then a bunch of guys who didn't understand what wrestling was about and were just watching chaos and carnage on a TV show wanted to get into wrestling and be wrestlers to do that shit. And so I'm glad to hear Paul admit from his own lips what I've accused him of in the past. It's your canvas. You paint. Well, no, because I fucking rented the building that the fucking art gallery is in right now. And I'm goddamn paying the water bill and the electric bill. And you might go and work for another art gallery, but I'm going to have to get some more artists in to replace you. So for the health of my entire art gallery, I'm not going to let one particular artist paint a bunch of dicks and pussies all over the wall. I'm going to leave them wanting something and something for us to come back with. But Paul admitted what he did. And then Conan goes to WCW, gets Ray the tryout. And did you like seeing Bischoff taking credit for creating the cruiserweight division? Like, he's the first person to ever push light heavyweight wrestlers or junior heavyweights or middleweights or whatever they called them in England or Japan or whatever. They just came up with the term. But I think he took credit there for inventing pushing smaller wrestlers.
Yeah, I mean, he's fairly benign in these things. And the problem is he either doesn't remember a lot of things accurately or sometimes he says things that are just wrong. But you know, he's trying to. I got to be honest. This one, I'm not going to complain too much. Even Bruce Pritchard, I thought everyone in this one up until some of the storylines when Ray went to WWE. I thought this was one of the best documentaries they've done. I thought every talking head did a pretty good job.
Well, and I like this also because as soon as I jotted that down and said that, they got to where Bischoff gets his in this about the mask. Eric Bischoff admitted that he wanted Rey Mysterio to unmask, and not only that, but he didn't understand why it was a big deal to Rey and why that he shouldn't be unmasking. He actually admitted that. I didn't know it was meant a lot to him personally. This fucking moron was doing business with AAA at the time and doing business with the luchadors and blah, blah, blah. And he had no idea that you couldn't just tell these guys, hey, take your mask off. Or he couldn't tell by looking at Oscar Gutierrez in the locker room, who looked 12 years old, that you shouldn't take the goddamn the kid's superhero's mask off and show him to be looking like he was 12 years old.
Yeah, no one wanted to see Rey Mysterio without a mask yelling hootie hoo with Master P and the No Limit Soldiers.
No, in the business at the time, everybody was shocked. They took his mask off. People's jaw dropped. Why the fuck would you do something like that? And they postponed it once. Eddie Guerrero put Rey over so he could keep the mask. And so then they do Hall and Nash against Rey and Conan with Elizabeth's hair versus Rey's mask. And then Bischoff gets his way, which, by the way, I wrote here in capital letters, was the stupidest thing ever done to Rey Mysterio or anyone else in the wrestling business. And Bischoff comes back and comments, well, in hindsight, I would have done it differently, but in the moment, considering what we knew and the blah, 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 I'd do it again. Well, you're a fucking moron. And at least later on, they had, obviously, I'm sure everybody said that, but they had Paul E say it best. Later on, when it comes time for Rey to go to the WWF, Paul E said it wasn't that we were so smart to put the mask back on. It was a refusal to be stupid enough to keep the mask off. That's the way everybody in the wrestling business thought. So Bischoff go, well, in hindsight, fuck you.
Yeah, no one at the time thought it was a good idea to take his mask off.
No, and I remember Rey actually, I think he had come down when they were trying him out, or he was getting back in the ring to work or do something. It was early on, right as he was coming into the WWE after Vince bought WCW. And he had set out for a while because he had the contract. But he was in the Davis Arena because he was in an HWA TV taping, and that's when we were taping Les Thatcher's program. And he was still working without the mask on. I'm like, what? I'm sitting there looking at him. Why the fuck? You've got a goddamn superhero or a grade schooler just with a piece of fabric. And this is the stupidest thing. So anyway, finally, they worm him in, and I remember this. Vince McMahon, this was not a rib. Vince McMahon, on and off for years, had wanted a goddamn Mighty Mouse. And I think other people at various points were considered for that. Was it Crash Holly at one point before he got settled in with what he was doing? Were they going to make him the Mighty Mouse? Was there another one? I'm trying to think.
He kind of was Mighty Mouse, all things considered, the way they booked him with Bob Holly. But with Rey Mysterio, obviously, it was a completely different thing.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I think at one point, he wanted an actual, like, Mighty Mouse. And then just kind of the Mighty Mouse gist of it, the small superhero, whatever the fuck. But Vince I think that's the only reason that they were able to get Rey wormed in there. And then, of course, he gets over. And did you see the difference in the presentation and in the life of everything he was doing? You see the WCW footage, and obviously in the matches, he's working with, guys like Psychosis or Eddie or whatever. The matches look great. But he's coming down. It's not the WWF production. It's not they weren't giving him a push, even if he was on top in WCW. When you are on top in the WWF, it's a completely different treatment. They gave him the contact lenses, the springing entrance out of the stage. They do little things, or at least they used to make you seem like a bigger star. So he got the big budget push there and the crossbody off the top of the cage. And I love, again, everybody's going, oh, goddamn, that was so great. I'll just do it. The dive off the top of the cage was a guy that weighs 140 pounds diving on two guys that were 6'6" and 280. And somehow people forget to examine the actual physics of these things and just go, well, he did it, I can do it. But the only thing I didn't like about the show, and it wasn't about the biography, it was just that they covered this at that length, and was obviously Rey and Eddie Guerrero were best friends, but they come up with the story that Eddie claims that he's Dominic's father instead of Rey, and the glee in which Bruce was explaining this whole idea and whole concept. It was obviously his idea. And this was a lot of what you had to deal with up there. They all loved horse shit like this. If whether it comes off of Jerry Springer or goddamn whatever, but we can't just blame Shitstain. They loved the idea, oh, let's bring a paternity test into it. Or, I don't know what their whole thing with parentage, paternity test, miscarriages, fake pregnancies, whatever the case. And so, spoiler, Rey won his son back in a ladder match. But that was, and sometimes I don't know whether like Rey saying, oh yes, it added dimension to me and it was a great story, we pulled it off or whatever. I don't know whether they really think that or whether they just don't want to come out and say, oh, I was goddamn miserable having to do this shit. Because Stockholm Syndrome, a lot of wrestlers now think that this kind of fucking soap opera hoo-ha is just, oh, it's so fun. But anyway, from Eddie's death in, November of 2005, Rey wins the Rumble in Eddie's honor and then wins the title at WrestleMania. And again, that was kind of like, if it had been, 7 years earlier or whatever, 6 years, whatever it was, it would have been a Mick Foley moment. It was still a big deal, but it wasn't quite the Yo, Adrian, I did it, that because of, Cactus's, the whole Attitude Era was hotter. But nobody ever thought that a guy Mysterio's size would win the WWF title.
Because of Vince.
Yeah. Well, in actuality, nobody else Rey Mysterio's size is ever going to win the WWF title, whether Vince is around or not. Because there'll never be anybody else that size that was perfect in every way. The emerging Hispanic market, superhero to the kids, everything that the WWF wanted to do or market to was wrapped up in Rey Mysterio. And remember, we've talked about this, and this was a rule of thumb in wrestling for years and years, and I don't know why they decided to amputate the thumb, but ethnic heroes, minority heroes, whatever you want, whether in whatever part of the country, in whatever time period, whether they were Greek, Jim Londos, or Italian, Bruno Sammartino, or Black, Bobo Brazil, or any type of ethnicity or race that was prevalent in a particular area, the wrestling promoters would always try to find a baby face to draw from that population. And that's why I never knew and didn't understand this until years afterward, but apparently that's why there was a bunch of Italians in Australia. That's why Barnett used Dominic DeNucci and guys like that. You would think in Australia, but, there's a heavy population in Ontario of whatever Tiger Jeet Singh, whatever nationality or extraction he was or whatever. I'm not going to try to bungle it, but that's why that he was huge there, because it was an ethnic connection. Well, Hispanic heroes especially have always gotten over to the Hispanic population, but they have to be top guys. They don't stick with their heroes if their heroes are not presented as main event level caliber, if they lose or if they get jacked around or whatever. And I'd mention, a lot of, it wasn't just the Mexican talent or Hispanic talent and the fans that felt that way. So I think they could have made Rey even bigger at that period of time when he was still young enough, didn't have injury problems. And I still don't think, even though they put the belt on him, they didn't push him as strongly as they could have. And that's why even though he was huge with the Hispanic market and a big draw with him, he wasn't ever as big as I thought he could have been. We've talked about that before. You can't, if you want the black folks to support the black baby face, if you want the Mexican folks to support the Mexican baby face on down the line, they have to be presented as top guys, not lucky to win the big one, but more often in the middle or whatever the case. You see what I'm saying? They got to have somebody to be behind that's credible.
Yeah, they have to believe in them. They have to choose them themselves, too. I mean, that's one of the reasons,
Alberto Del Rio didn't work because they didn't choose him.
Everyone after JYD didn't work because those fans felt like those new black superstars that would show up in Mid-South are being forced down their throats. All of a sudden, Master G is there and various people. It wasn't natural. They didn't accept him the way they chose the dog.
Well, and I did not realize this until they showed the footage. I read about it at the time and then put out of my mind who the opponent was. But when he took time off, Rey, too many pronouns, pal, from the WWE, and he was having the stem cell therapy for all of his injuries, and he had gotten in trouble with pain medications, like apparently everybody does, I guess, but his wife threw him away and made him go to rehab. But while he was out of WWE, he was one of the opponents for the match in Tijuana when Paraguayo Jr. died.
I hate that they showed footage of that. It really makes me uncomfortable.
Well, because
the footage they showed was literally him dead in the ring.
Yeah. Well, I mean, him leaning on the ropes first, obviously not with it, and then him dead. But the newspaper headline, it flashed. I saw cervical, and it was in Spanish, obviously. But did he have a spinal injury, or was that a heart attack?
I thought it was a broken neck. I have to go back and check, but I believe he broke his neck when he hit the rope, they think. And that's why as soon as he hit the rope, he was dead.
That's right. That's what it was. When he went down for the 619.
Yeah, when Rey went right over the top of him, thankfully, and missed him. I believe his neck had been broken right before that.
And that's when he had the look on his face like, but it wasn't a vicious neck snap type of thing. It was just one of those deals where it was time for it to break. But anyway, so that obviously was a down part of the program, but then they come back to the return in the WWE and the 2018 Rumble, and Dominic turns pro, and they team at WrestleMania 2022 and get matching outfits to honor Art Barr and Eddie Guerrero, and everybody lived happily ever after.
Hey, just to clarify, Paraguayo Jr.'s cause of death was cardiac arrest due to a cervical stroke caused by 3 fractured vertebrae.
Okay.
He broke C1, C2, and C3.
Good Lord. So the neck injury caused we were both right, and we both remembered hearing that a neck injury caused enough shock to lead to cardiac arrest. Good heavens.
I hadn't watched that footage since, it all first happened, and it was all over the news. It was on TMZ and everything, and I can't even imagine Conan's there at ringside, touching him because he doesn't realize what's happened yet. Rey's in the ring.
He was shaking him like, wake up, wake up.
I mean, it's just such an uncomfortable thing to watch, and you feel for everyone involved in that. It's hard to imagine, when it's something like that, when it's a move that Rey Mysterio does to a guy in every single match now, you have to wonder what that does to someone's head going into the next match, thinking that if someone hits the ropes, this is a possibility of what could happen.
Well, but again, that's not it. There wasn't force. It's a freak thing. There wasn't force that you go into the ropes like that. And if you take it right, it alleviates some of that. But they've talked about, same thing happened with Misawa, right? Where it's just at some point, something's going to break. Whether if you twist the paperclip long enough, it's going to break. And so that we see these constant bumps and falls and people being flung on their head and go, oh, man, Big E was flung on his head and did break his neck. But we think, holy shit, but they live through them and they don't get injured sometimes. But that doesn't mean that the next time that they fall like that, even if it's not as hard or as violent or with as much momentum, that it's just not going to be time for whatever the fuck it is to just fucking break. And this has never been a thing in wrestling before until the last 20 years. It's always like, oh, watch out, don't break your leg, don't fall on somebody, or, don't take a bad bump through the ropes or whatever, but not just in the process of regularly going about a normal match. There's shit happening that may very well paralyze your ass. It's fucking insane. But anyway, that was Biography. And again, Rey Mysterio, not only a nice guy and a deserving guy, but also a 1 in a million talent that can overcome things that a regular person couldn't overcome because they have an extraordinary amount of talent or ability or charisma or likability or psychology in their head. Ray's not a great promo like Mick Foley, but he had other attributes that made him stand out and be special, and the costume and the gimmick and the persona, they all love to use these words, that he created. That's what made him stand out. And he still was trained in the wrestling business. And everything that I've ever seen, and I've mentioned this, even though he does the flips and the dives, everything you see Ray do technically still makes sense. Technically still looks like he's in a fight or a contest where he's trying to win something. He understands it's the drama of the young, small underdog babyface selling and coming back with his speed and agility instead of just the goddamn, oh, he did a quadruple backflip with a triple twist and a touch of lime or whatever. So, I think that unfortunately, a bunch more people that are 5'2" and 140 pounds are going to see that and go, well, I can put a mask on and be Rey Mysterio. No, you can't. Only Rey Mysterio can do that.
Hey, before you wrap this thing up, what did you think of the stuff at the end with Dominic Mysterio, who, despite what he is in the ring, comes across like the nicest guy in the
He is, I know. It is. I feel bad that I've mocked his appearance in the past, but he is the nicest guy in the world. But I don't want to criticize this guy and make him upset, but let's be honest. If his father was not Rey Mysterio Jr., would he be in the ring right now? No. And, so it works that father and son, and they got something out of it, whatever, but Dominic Mysterio is not going to have the long upper echelon career that his dad did, for the same reason that a lot of other sons of famous, Frank Sinatra Jr. did not have the platinum selling, track record of his dad, even though he was quite an adequate singer for small clubs and, various things like that.
And kidnappers everywhere.
And kidnappers everywhere. Every junior, every offspring, every son is not going to be as good or better than the father. And that's, no shame. But no, Dominic does not have the build nor the face to be a wrestler. But he had an in because he is Rey Mysterio's son, and they wanted to tell a story. And I don't blame any kid for wanting to do what their father did for a living. But, at some point when Ray is retired, I don't know that Dominic is going to have a long future in this occupation.
Really good biography. I was uncomfortable, like I said, with the Perro Aguayo Jr. footage. You have to tell that story, but, when you know what's happening there, it's a little uncomfortable seeing it. And, again, I get it that WWE itself may be proud of the Rey-Eddie Guerrero feud over paternity, but I didn't like it at the time, and I really didn't like it now, and there's no justification for it, and pretending like that was good is like pretending like the shit after Eddie died where they said Eddie was going to burn in hell is good. No, there's sometimes you can go too far, and some things just are not good, and I didn't like... There's so many things you could have done, you didn't have to do that with Rey and Eddie.
Right. Because they were best friends and they had great matches and they each were completely selfless with wanting to get the other one over. So they didn't have to argue over custody of the children. But nevertheless, it's the WWE and they love that kind of thing.